I was doing an apprenticeship in 1958 and working on major multi-storey sort of stuff. The asbestos was in the form of an insulation on steam, condensate and hot water pipework. I used to get it in a bag, tip it into a bucket with water and mix it up with a paddle, and in fact sometimes we used to throw it at each other. As an apprentice, I even used to ride a push bike down North Terrace, down Port Road to a company that was a supplier, and I would come back with like a dust all over my face and my arms where the wind would be blowing the product out of the bag into my face, and we never thought any more of it. The next time the issue of asbestos came into my life, I used to walk the stairs two at a time, and towards the end of my working life at 52, I found that I wasn't doing the job like I used to. Actually went to my GP for a full medical, and that's when the x-rays come forth with indication that I had a reduction in my lung capacity of approximately 40%. It took nearly 27 years to come to the surface as I got a little bit older that I had a problem. I couldn't understand it because I had never been a smoker. I went and had lung capacity tests at the Flinders University, and I had a leading authority there told me that my future was very, very limited, and a window of time was very minimal for a person that was only 53. I had some other professional help that suggested that I move into a salty environment because that's receptive to your lungs, the salt. And my wife and I decided to relocate where we live today on York Peninsula. Not only did it affect me emotionally, not knowing how much lifespan I had left, it affected me financially hugely, where I couldn't work. I was well paid for the job I did, and I just had to adjust my life to a more moderate life. We just had to change. That was now, today, 23 years ago, and I think because I listened to the people, the advice they gave me has been good for myself and my wife.
Asbestos is a unique hazard in the work environment. It is very difficult to identify and seemingly poses no immediate threat or is often ignored. But in fact, it's very common in many materials found in all kinds of buildings or structures, and there is no safe level of exposure to asbestos. If not treated with caution, it could drastically impact your life, and you may not even know you're in trouble, as diseases caused by inhaling asbestos may take decades to appear. By then, the damage may be irreversible. You can take precautions, however, and a little education, care, and some simple workplace safety can go a long way to help if you're in the presence of asbestos-containing material, or ACM.
In general experience with new people you're training, they say this is a lot of extra work, it's not really necessary, it's a waste of time. When you sit face to face with somebody that's just been diagnosed with mesothelioma and they say, I thought that once and now I'm looking down the barrel at the results of next few months will be my end of me. If I'm about to start work with a new contractor, maybe my first, one of the questions I should be asking is, how do you work with asbestos? Do you have safe work procedures? Do you wear PPE? If the answer is no, I don't think, we need to make sure the company we're about to start with has proper procedures so I'm safe.
Asbestos is a naturally occurring fibrous silicate mineral. The asbestos we know is mostly white asbestos, mixed into products such as asbestos cement sheeting. It was popular for its price, heat-resistant attributes and long life, and is very common. In Australia, non-friable asbestos makes up 95% of all asbestos products and is the type most commonly encountered. Even though it contains an average of just 10% asbestos, it is responsible for the greatest number of fatalities due to its prevalence. Friable asbestos is a loose, soft, crumbly, fluffy material and was commonly used for soundproofing, backing to vinyl sheeting, fireproofing, or spray insulation, and the makeup of asbestos in these materials is approximately 75 to 100%. Fibers in friable asbestos are invisible and can become airborne easily, making them exceptionally dangerous. Friable asbestos makes up around 5% of all asbestos products. Asbestos was a key building material until the mid to late 1980s, by which time the long-term health impacts were both scientifically proven and clear to the community at large. It was used in commercial, industrial, and residential properties. In fact, around 2 out of 3 houses built before 1987 are likely to contain asbestos. Eventually, in late 2003, asbestos-containing materials were banned.
A colleague of mine that I used to work with in the UK, he wasn't even involved in any industry that it really involved asbestos. His main exposure came from his father. So his father was in the construction industry. Back in the day when they used to use lagging and chuck it on with their bare hands, he used to come home from work with his overalls on, greet his family, give his son a hug, and apparently that's where he breathed the fibres in. So it was transferred from his father's overalls onto him as a young child, and it developed when he was started to show symptoms when he was in his late 20s, and unfortunately it ended with him dying when he was in his early 30s. I think from my experience it just means it can happen to anybody. You don't have to be particularly working with asbestos to be affected by it.
No matter what type of building or workplace you may be working on, if it is older than 1987, the chances are it could be anywhere, and often in places you may not expect. No matter whether you're a plumber, electrician, a carpenter, or performing maintenance, you and your assistants face risks that are extremely serious if not managed correctly. Asbestos is very difficult to identify, and the only safe solution is to undertake training in asbestos awareness and be prepared to stop work if you're unsure if a material you are called to work on may contain asbestos. The places you may encounter asbestos-containing material include walls, roofing and cladding, fencing, sheds and ridge capping, moulded products such as downpipes and flues, and gable ends and lining under eaves. Just about any task undertaken on a typical site, from construction, renovation, maintenance and any work, can bring you into contact with asbestos-containing material. Cutting into asbestos-containing materials to install fixings, replacing tapwork or electrical fittings, removing or cutting into walls or sheeting containing asbestos products, sanding asbestos sheets for painting or water blasting sheets, and stormwater pipework and work on fences containing asbestos materials. Asbestos is particularly dangerous because it's indestructible and never breaks down. It is effectively invisible to the naked eye. It can occur in many places you may not expect. Even at a low level, regular exposure to ACM can be lethal in the long term.
There are a number of diseases associated with asbestos exposure, and the most concerning disease that patients can get is mesothelioma, and that's really a very close association with asbestos exposure, and particularly associated with time from exposure and to a lesser extent the type of fibre. What happens with asbestos is that it's respirable, that is, you can inhale it. The body's usual way of dealing with inhaled products is to capture them in sputum, for example, or phlegm, and then cough it up. However, with asbestos being a long, sharp, needle-like fibre, the usual ways of eliminating don't work, and so the asbestos fibres are very difficult for the body to eliminate, and so they can stay in the tissues for many years. You would rarely see pleural plaque less than 10 to 15 years after asbestos exposure, Mesothelioma is commonly 30 or 40 years more after exposure. Asbestos is 20 to 30 years. Often patients have even forgotten that they had asbestos exposure, and it takes significant sleuthing to work out when their asbestos exposure was. But don't be blasé, because it doesn't take a lot of asbestos exposure to then have a risk for future medical problems, particularly things such as mesothelioma.
There is no way to identify asbestos other than by scientific evidence. A sample must be taken to an accredited laboratory. If anyone you work with suggests they can identify asbestos in products, they are putting themselves and those around them in extreme danger. The Work Health and Safety Act requires all businesses not to put their workers at any risk while working on, with, or around ACM. If asbestos needs to be worked on, or around, or removed from premises, there are strict controls around how this should happen and the process taken. The risks apply to all people across all jobs, no matter what size. If non-friable asbestos is damaged, it can become friable and fibres may be inhaled. When non-friable asbestos is encountered, and it is under 10 square metres, you can work around it or remove it if you're suitably trained and have the correct personal protective equipment or PPE. However, you must meet all of the legislative requirements if you plan to remove the hazard. You must carry out the job in the same manner as a licensed person would, and be trained in asbestos awareness, identification, and working with asbestos prior to commencing work. PPE is specifically designed for the safe handling of asbestos-containing material and must be worn at all times. It must be maintained correctly to ensure it's fit for purpose and not damaged in any way. If you are removing non-friable asbestos in a quantity over 10 square metres, it must be removed by an appropriately licensed asbestos removal contractor with the appropriate training, PPE, and a Class B licence. If removing friable asbestos-containing material, you must have a full removal licence Class A. All friable asbestos removal in Australia must use air monitoring. This is also mandatory in some states for non-friable ACM as well. Clearance monitoring will indicate when it is safe for people to re-enter their work area. When working around asbestos-containing material on site, your first priority must be to avoid disturbing the material. If you are disturbing it by drilling or cutting, you must follow your safe work method statement and wear all correct PPE for the task. There are 6 steps to managing safety which you must follow if removing non-friable asbestos waste from an area you are working in under 10 square metres. Check the premises for an asbestos register to locate known locations of ACM. If it is unclear which material is asbestos, stop and contact your supervisor or team leader. If you are working on your own, you must stop and contact an asbestos competent person. Examine the situation and act in accordance with your safe work method statement for the task. An assessment of your expertise, equipment, and PPE is also essential to determine if you can manage the job, noting that you must complete the process once you have commenced. Flag off the area, erect signage to restrict access, advise anyone in the vicinity, including householders if in a private home. Set up the work area in accordance with your job report, safe work method statement, and instruction guidelines. After checking the condition of all safety suits and PPE, you can then suit up, ready for the removal process. Wet down the area before and during work to reduce fibres in the air. Minimize breakage, and on completion, place all contaminated material in a bag or wrapped in sheeting and then label and seal securely. During and after completion of the task, clean down the job and the tools and dispose of any wet rags by placing them in waste bags or sheets. Carefully remove your suit and disposable PPE and place with waste materials. Wash up carefully once finished. A Asbestos waste materials should be disposed of promptly in accordance with the EPA requirements. Asbestos waste must be bagged up in sizes that can be transported safely and sprayed before loading. Waste must be disposed of at a landfill or a transfer station licensed to handle the waste. Asbestos is a serious hazard and must be approached with a clear plan and the right people and resources to manage it safely. It is the responsibility of all trades and those around them to be trained in a safe system of work, have the correct safe work method statement in place, and comply with the regulations. Training and the correct PPE must be used at all times it is required, and every worker should be able to stop work if they're feeling anything is unsafe in any way. When managers and workers are trained, it reduces the risk of exposure, fines, and penalties. When you consider the risk, it's certainly worth taking all the right precautions to protect you and your workmates' future health and well-being.
I didn't really think about asbestos too much until I recently just visited my grandparents, and I could hear my grandpa wheezing and not sounding too healthy. So I spoke up to him and asked him, is he okay? Asthma and that, and he told me it's from being exposed to asbestos. And so that kind of thing was a bit of a step back into reality of, Chanel, take a couple minutes out, look around in what you're working in, because I've seen it firsthand of what it's doing to my grandpa. It scares me the most because it's not going to show up until 30 years later, and by that point I could possibly have a family, and I don't want to be not here for my family or my children. I'd like to be here as long as possible.
Look, it took me 27 years to discover the problem I had. Sadly, if you don't look very carefully at what you do, you could be in the situation that I've got myself into. It's just important that you think about what you're doing, just don't go and do tasks blindly.